Okay, so here you can see that the heating up process has already started, and I'm doing this in order to remove original stock GPU. As you have noticed, I'm using a customized PCB holder and also a homemade DIY rework station. I won't go into details about the station this time, because it took me a very long time to build, so I believe it deserves its own video. But in any case, this part of the process usually takes about 40 minutes, so I'm just going to fast forward it a little bit. So right around this point the temperature was reached, and there I was just testing if the solder was melted. And then I just shut down the machine and went ahead to lift off the chip. And after that I needed to remove the leftover solder, so at first I was just using a soldering iron and a lot of flux. Next, I just took a soldering wick and tried to get rid of the rest. To clean off the flux, I used isopropyl alcohol and cotton swabs. So this is the chip that I'm going to install today, and hopefully you can see the serial number. This is supposed to be new old stock, so it means it's brand new. And here I'm taking some resistances to show that this chip is perfectly fine. Sometimes some of these values are either too high or too low, and in that case it would indicate that there is some damage inside the chip. But this time all the measurements were within normal limits. And in fact you can use these values as an example of a perfectly working RSX chip. Alright, so the next step was deleting the RSX. At first I was using the Gillette razors, but I couldn't push them deep enough. I couldn't cut through the epoxy deep enough, so I ended up using them for the starting cuts, and then I finished it off with a painter's knife. And of course, when using these painter's knives, you must remember that they are somewhat thick for this task, so if you're not careful it could cause damage to the processor, because every time when you insert it in between the heat spreader and the VRAM chips, it could sometimes create a slight warping of the PCB. So you have to watch out for that, and yeah, be careful not to cause extreme warping, because in that case chances are you've already damaged your processor. Because this chip came pre-balled, I decided to remove the original lead-free balls, because they require higher temperatures, and again there's higher chance of causing unpleasant accidents such as popcorning or something that could kill the chip. Once the leftover solder was removed, I then applied a very thin layer of flux, and I also had to spread it evenly across the surface. So then the procedure is pretty standard because I've already shown it actually in one of my videos. I'm using the blue jig, and then I simply add the stencil on top. Of course the GPU had to be aligned with the stencil, and I just throw a bunch of balls on top of it. And of course then you need to make sure that all the holes were filled. So after lifting the stencil off, you have to check for the missing balls or the misaligned balls, and this is what I had to do again. So there you could see I was adding some of the missing ones back in, making sure that they were perfectly placed across the surface. And then I just used hot air to solder them on. So once I was finished with reballing, I moved on to the main board again, and I added flux on top of the pads, and of course it needs to be spread evenly. Again, you have to make sure that there are no thick spots or thin spots anywhere on the pads. And then you just carefully place the newly reballed chip. And in my case, I also decided to add a little piece of foil on top of the silicon, because the temperature at the top is always going to be higher than at the bottom. So this is just a small protective measure. And during this fragment, you can actually see as the solder balls are melting, the chip kind of lowers itself. So that's when you can see that it's soldered, even though I was also following the temperature profile. But it's actually interesting that you can also see it on camera like that. And once I was finished with soldering it, I decided to again take some measurements to ensure that it got soldered correctly, because sometimes the balls get merged or, you know, don't solder all the way or something like that. So here I had some reference values of a working board, so I just compared my measurements to the ones on that board. And you will notice that some of the values are going to be higher than the ones in the picture, but that is still okay, because the board on the picture is actually COK001, and also it might have a different 40 nanometer variant. There are several revisions of them, and some of them might have slightly different resistances as well. But the point remains the same. You're checking this to see that there are no short circuits or open circuits, and also no values that seem suspiciously low in comparison to the board on the picture. Next, I needed to do the resistor modifications, and I started it with the diagonal resistor change. So as you may remember, in some of the previous videos I was showing how to do it, and here you can also see the schematic of how it should be. So one resistor is taken off, and then another one is moved from one place into the other and into the diagonal position. So once that was finished, I then decided to test that the board is working, and for this particular board, which is COK002, you don't need to add any other resistors in order to start the board. This doesn't mean that the job is finished. I still need to do voltage modifications, but this is a good time now to modify the Syscon to recognize this 40 nanometer RSX and test if the board will start up or not. Because if it doesn't start at this point, then something went wrong. So I'm using the code that you can see on the screen right now, and I'm also going to upload this PDF with all the necessary code modifications for different models of the graphics processors. So all I'm doing is just editing some of the lines which are responsible for recognizing the type of RSX, and somehow it allows for the Syscon to accept it and, you know, do the bit training for it and do all the checks that it normally does and just allow the system to boot. And just in case you missed the news, there's no more need to use any mod chips in order to get the board to accept the 40 nanometer GPU, because now it's enough to modify a few lines of code in the Syscon using the UART adapter. So this part got significantly easier comparing to how you needed to order a mod chip all the way from Indonesia and you couldn't even buy it directly. And so here you can see the example of how to correctly fix your checksum, and the first address that you have to fix, as you can see here, it's at 32 FE, and it also says which correction you should make. So for instance, in this case it was 64.7C, but of course, because of the big endian, you have to kind of type down these bytes in the backwards order. So you start with 7C and then you put 64. And the same thing goes for the 34 FE. So in this case, you have to correct it with 1559. In your case, the numbers might be slightly different. And then you can see that the checksum is fixed and there's no more warnings that start with the word sum. So if that's the message you get, then everything is corrected, and then you can just boot up the system. And by the way, these are the errors that you will get if you forgot to modify your Syscon. As you can see, these are the errors that are similar to what you get when there's a problem with RSX itself or BGA under it. But in this case, there's a slight difference because it gets stuck at flex ID step of the bit training. So the error numbers are the same, but it is the first stage of the bit training sequence where it's trying to identify the graphics processor, and it cannot do that because it doesn't recognize 40 nanometer yet. So this is something you should keep in mind. Well, as you can see, the system booted up just fine, and this means that the swap was a success. Okay, so for this next step, I'm going to modify the voltage from 1.2 volts down to 0.95, and this step is highly recommended in order to avoid causing any damage to the new RSX. And the method I'm going to show here is the official one, which is what Sony did on their refurbished boards. But before that, let's rewind a little bit. As you may remember, in the previous videos I explained how to do this mod by only replacing one component, and it was a MOSFET, which I then replaced with a whole voltage regulator IC, and it doesn't need a MOSFET to work. But that was not the most proper way to do it, because we were basically hacking the circuit, bypassing the original MOSFET driver and inserting a new IC at the last stage of the circuit. And that method works too, but in that situation you are adding a new voltage regulator while the original BD3520 FVM MOSFET controller is still there in the circuit as well, and it's still active. And that may be adding some kind of extra noise into the system. You could say that we should just remove that BD3520 entirely, but I haven't tested it. I don't know if it would cause the issues with the Syscon. It could be that it's still trying to sense that this MOSFET driver is working, and that's why it's possible that it needs to stay there either way. It seems to me that the way Sony did it was more appropriate, because that way there's no extra components left in the circuit that are still trying to produce that original 1.2 volts, kind of hanging there half connected. And here's the interesting part about PWRGOOD threshold changes. I wrote that it's not recommended at the moment because I talked to Felix about it, and like I've mentioned before, he's been doing a massive research on the circuit design, and we came to a conclusion that it's not a good idea to lower these thresholds because that would allow more ripple noise through. And what I mean by that is unfiltered AC voltage would be entering into the processor, before the system would trigger an error. So the reason why Sony did it, at least in our opinion, was because they wanted to also prevent a potential NEC token failure, which can also happen, but they didn't want to replace the NEC tokens because they were probably quite expensive at the time. So they kind of decided to also cut corners and simply reduce the lower thresholds so that a little bit more noisy voltage could enter the processor, which I think it might prevent YLOD based on NEC token failures, but at the same time it's reducing the life of the processors in the long term. At least this is our theory at the moment. And I also made this PDF file with the instructions of which components to replace and how to calculate the necessary resistor values. As you can see, I tried to explain everything you need to know. If you don't want to go too deeply into the calculations, you can just use exactly the same values as Sony, which is 3.9K and 1.8K resistors. But in my case, I didn't have those particular ones laying around, so I had to kind of improvise, so I decided to calculate my own. It doesn't change anything at all because, you know, the point is still the same, the result is still the same. This formula may also be useful for some of you in case you have spare boards and you don't have those specific values. In my case, I took some of the resistors from SEM board, which is used in CECHG models. Another useful info that this PDF contains are the necessary codes for different models of PlayStations and different models of RSX chips. The codes that you need to enter into the Syscon if you are doing this type of Frankenstein mod. So yeah, do check it out and hopefully this will be helpful to you. So for this last step, I'm going to add extra capacitors in parallel to NEC tokens. And this will increase the total capacitance on the off chance that NEC tokens begin to degrade. And I'm not saying that they are already failing, I'm just doing it more as a preventive maintenance, because even though it has been proven that they rarely fail on the backwards compatible consoles, there's still a chance that they may lose some capacitance over time. And you don't have to repeat this step if you don't want to. Just in my opinion, it really is simple enough and it doesn't hurt to have more capacitance just in case. Also in this example I didn't do it the best way. As you may notice, I have tried to fit them into the spot where the metal sheet cover has an opening so that they wouldn't be pressing against it. But it proved to be very difficult to solder them so close to the NEC tokens, so I ended up damaging the casing of the NEC tokens a little bit, and while it shouldn't affect their performance, it still wasn't maybe the most professional example, and it wasn't the prettiest sight when you will see it at the end. But I never said that I was perfect at this. In the end, all of this is still experimental, and we're still just learning and experimenting the whole time, so don't take this too seriously. And by the way, in case you're wondering what is that white cardboard piece which is pressing against the tokens, well, that is just something I had to use as a padding when I was scoping the ripple noise of the NEC tokens. So I needed to have access to the top of the board, and I also needed to attach the heatsink, so this was the way to do it. And you can also see the results of the measurements that I made with oscilloscope in the link in the description, where I tried to compare the effect of these extra capacitors, and it confirms that ripple noise is reduced after adding these tantalums. And so I wanted to add a few closing words about this project. Everything I showed and explained is currently relevant, but you must remember that every now and then there are new developments made, so in the future it's possible that it could affect some of the steps that I described in here. Another point I would like to make is that this repair will not make your PlayStation immortal. And I mean, it should be more reliable now that we repaired this specific GPU fault. There are several reasons why it can still fail later on. First of all, we only replaced one component, but there are hundreds of others that could fail, and if you look at the link in the description, which has a full list of Syscon error codes, you will see that there's a large variety of errors that could trigger another YLOD fault. So anytime something fails on the motherboard, you could get this problem back. And it doesn't mean that RSX was the only one that could trigger this. Like I'm trying to say, there are many other components that could still trigger another error. Of course, it could be that RSX was the most vulnerable component, and so the chances of others failing are not so high, but it's still impossible to predict. Which brings me to the second reason, is that we are dealing with a very old hardware. It's over 16 years old, and also most of these machines have already had some use on them. So for instance, this one had about 120 days of use, and many of these used PlayStations that you buy, some of them could have 200 days of use, others have 300, so obviously this kind of amount will have some effect. The motherboard will already be worn out to some extent, so again, it's impossible to know. Like, maybe this one will last 10 years, maybe it will last 1 year before something else could fail again. So yeah, this is important to understand. I don't want anyone to think that now all they have to do is replace the GPU so that their systems will be like super future proof, because this is very similar to what happened when people believed that neck token was the issue. And while this time we can actually diagnose the true faults a lot better, it's still just too easy to fall into this type of thinking where you believe that if you only do this and that, then your system will last forever. But it doesn't work like that, so just try to remember that. Okay, so before I wrap this up, you might ask if I'm offering this type of service, and unfortunately I personally don't work on other people's PlayStations. It's just too much risk and not worth it for me. I'm not a business and I'm doing this for a hobby, but I will put contact details of a few technicians who are offering it. One of them is from USA, another one is from Europe. I myself also got a couple of Japanese models which have full PlayStation 2 hardware inside, so Ketcha's models, and I was planning to swap the GPU in them because they all have yellow light of death, and sell them possibly on eBay, I'm not sure yet. So if you're really interested and serious about buying one, you can contact me on Discord and we can try to work something out. It's a lot easier that way if I know that there's already a potential buyer waiting, rather than just putting it up on sale and hoping that somebody buys. So if you enjoyed this video, you should probably subscribe to my channel. I don't post regularly, but I still do this as a hobby every now and then. And also, on a final note, I would like to say a big shout out to the PSX community. This video wouldn't be possible without the information and research that was shared in there. But anyway, thanks for watching and have a good day.